The Lost Boys. In December 1970, two teenagers disappeared from the Heights neighborhood in Houston. Then another and another and another. As the number of missing kids grew, no one realized that the most prolific serial killer the country had ever seen, along with his teenage accomplices, was living comfortably among them, or that the mystery of what happened to so many of his victims would haunt the city to this day. One morning this past September, Mrs. Mary Scott walked out of her tiny brick house, one hand clutching a plastic tub of birdseed, the other holding on to the front door in case she lost her balance. Taking her time, she stepped off the front stoop and onto a pebbled sidewalk that her husband, Walter, dead now for a decade, had laid down one weekend in the mid-60s. From out of nowhere, a half a dozen doves arrived, soon followed by a half a dozen more. "Look at that one. That's all white," Mrs. Scott said. "Mrs. Whitney, I call her." Suddenly her voice faltered, the doves forgotten. Mrs. Scott had noticed a young man down the block walking past one of the new three-storied townhomes that now line the street, some of them still unoccupied, the builders' signs advertising wood-paneled ceilings, recessed lighting, and granite countertops. She stared in his direction, her eyes blinking behind her glasses. For a moment, she didn't seem sure what to do. "Sometimes I see someone and I think it's my son," she said. "I think he's come home." Mrs. Scott, who is 83 years old, lives on West 25th Street in the Heights, a Houston neighborhood about 5 miles northwest of downtown. On April 20th, 1972, her 17-year-old son, Mark, a blue-eyed kid whose cheeks dimpled when he smiled, walked out the front door of that house and was never seen again. Mr. and Mrs. Scott and their younger son Jeff called Mark's friends and classmates asking if they had seen him. They got in their car and roamed the streets, peering down alleys and stopping at the local drive-in restaurants. They called the hospitals to see if Mark had been admitted, and Walter, a self-employed carpenter and handyman, drove to the Houston Police Department to report Mark was missing. A few days later, they received what seemed to be a hastily written postcard from Mark. "How are you doing?" he wrote. "I am in Austin for a couple of days. I found a good job. I am making $3 an hour." His mother and father shook their heads in disbelief. Their son, who was only a junior in high school, had left for Austin without saying a word. They were convinced that something terrible had happened. Mark hadn't even taken his beloved Honda C70 motorcycle. Mrs. Scott was then 44 years old, a switchboard operator for the Drescher Industries. In those first few weeks, she left work early to wait on her stoop, looking left and right. She walked to the chain-link fence at the edge of the yard, cocked her head, and stared down the street. Some days she would meet the postman at the mailbox to see if he had another postcard. But Mark never wrote again. He never called. "At night, whenever I heard a noise, I would get out of bed and walk to the front door," Mrs. Scott says. "I always prayed he would be there so I could give him a hug." Then on the evening of August 8, 1973, the Houston television stations cut into their regular programming, and Mrs. Scott, sitting on the flower-printed couch in the living room, stared at her black and white screen and sensed that her prayers would forever go unanswered. According to the reporters, a 33-year-old man named Dean Corll had been shot to death at his home in Pasadena, a Houston suburb. The police had learned that Corll had been renting a metal storage shed located just off a narrow dead-end street about 9 miles southwest of downtown. Detectives were at the shed now. The reporters continued, their voices rising, and they were digging up the bodies of teenage boys, all of whom had apparently been murdered by Carroll. Checking their notes, the reporters said Carroll had once been a resident of the Heights, where he had helped his mother run a small candy factory on West 22nd Street. Mrs. Scott grabbed her husband's hand and said, "Oh, Mark, our poor Mark." By the next day, the police officers were exhuming the bodies from the wooded area near Sam Rayburn Reservoir, outside Lufkin, and on a beach at High Island east of Houston. Some of the bodies were covered with a layer of lime powder and shrouded in clear plastic, their faces looking up at the men uncovering them. Others were nothing more than a lump of petrified flesh. A few still had tape strapped around their mouths, others had nylon ropes wrapped around their necks or bullet holes in their heads. One boy was curled up in a fetal position. Within a week, the remains of 27 young males had been found, a couple of them as young as 13, one as old as 20. The New York Times quickly labeled the killings the largest multiple murder case in the United States history. The phrase serial killer had not yet been coined, surpassing the 13 women choked to death by the Boston Strangler in the early 60s, the 16 people shot by Charles Whitman in 1966 from the tower at the University of Texas, and the 25 inerrant workers killed by Juan Corona in California just 2 years earlier. Soon reporters began flying to the Houston from every corner of the United States. A few arrived from as far away as Japan and Pakistan. Even Truman Capote, hoping to revive his floundering career and produce his next In Cold Blood, showed up, wearing his signature Panama hat, smoking cigarettes, and being trailed by an entourage of assistants. It wasn't just the number of murders that caught everyone's attention. Of the victims, the medical examiner's office was able to identify at least 20 of them had been residents of either the Heights or an adjoining neighborhood, or they were Houston boys who had been somewhere in the Heights right before they disappeared. All of the Heights victims had gone missing between December 13, 1970 and July 25, 1973. 11 of them had attended the same junior high. How Capote and everyone else wanted to know, was it possible that so many boys could have been snatched away from one working class area of Houston, a mere 2 mile wide and 3 miles deep, without anyone, police, parents, neighbors, teachers, or friends, snapping to what was happening? And why, they asked, had Carroll wanted to kill them? Big and broad-shouldered, with thick black hair and sideburns, he was known in the words of one reporter as the pleasant-smiling candy man of the Heights, always handing out treats to neighborhood children who dropped by his mother's factory. A police officer who had gone to high school with Carroll and married his cousin insisted that he was a quiet, well-mannered, well-groomed, considerate person. He had a nice girlfriend, Betty, a single mother who let her children call him Daddy. No one in the Heights could fathom that Carroll, who had no criminal record of any kind, could be the worst predator in American history. As one man put it, he didn't have no temper.